This is episode 134 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at castycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hello, I'm Sir Stanley Wells. I'm Honorary President of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
I think the injustice that Kyd has faced in death echoes the final years of his life. As the authorities suspected Marlowe of writing a heretical poem posted on the walls of a Dutch church, Kyd was arrested and tortured in his absence. And Kyd would die in disgrace despite being an innocent man.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
The English playwright Thomas Kyd is one of Shakespeare's contemporaries who arguably has as much, if not more, influence on the development of Renaissance theater than even the bard himself. Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy is thought to have introduced to 16th century English theater a tragic format Shakespeare would later apply in his famous tragedy, Hamlet. Little is known about the life of Thomas Kyd, but what we do know is astonishing. He was a roommate with Christopher Marlowe, suspected of treason, accused of being an atheist, and had the entire memory of his life rest on a single letter he wrote to decry claims against him. He died in December of 1594, leaving a powerful mark on the theater industry and establishing himself a permanent place in the life of William Shakespeare. Here this week to introduce to us Thomas Kyd and the history we have about his life as a fellow playwright alongside William Shakespeare in turn of the 17th century England is our returning guest and respected friend, Darren Freebury Jones. Dr. Darren Freebury Jones is lecturer in Shakespeare Studies at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. His role involves building and developing relationships with schools, universities, and organizations in the USA through regular teaching tours, working on the Trust's online educational resources, as well as lecturing at the Shakespeare Center. Darren's research interests include early modern attribution studies, digital approaches to examining drama, and intertextuality. His doctoral thesis examines Thomas Kyd's influence on Shakespeare's early work, and he is one of the editors of the first edition of Kyd's collected works since 1901. He has also investigated the boundaries of John Marston's dramatic corpus as part of the Oxford Marston Project. His recent and forthcoming work on the plays of authors such as Shakespeare, Kyd, Lyly, Marlowe, Peele, Nash, Marston, Dekker, Fletcher, and others can be found in a range of peer-reviewed journals. Hello, Darren. Welcome back to the show. So glad to have you.
Good morrow, Cassidy. It's great to be back.
So how did Thomas Kyd come to London originally?
Well, Kyd was actually London-born and bred. And the editor of the first edition of Kyd's works in 1901, Frederick S. Bowers, went so far as to call him a Cockney dramatist. Kyd was baptized on the 6th of November, 1558, so 6 years before Shakespeare, in the Church of St. Mary Woolnoth in the ward of Langbourne, Lombard Street, London. And he was the son of Anna Kyd and Francis Kyd, a scrivener, a professional scribe. And it's pretty likely that Kyd was at some point engaged in his father's trade. Kyd's handwriting, as it survives in 2 letters of 1593 to 94, says John Puckering, is remarkably clear and formal, which suggests the training of a scrivener. And Kyd would have had an excellent classical education at Merchant Taylor's School in Suffolk Lane near Thames Street and across the river from the Clink prison. The register of Merchant Taylors' School shows that he entered the school in 1565, and there he was taught by the classical scholar and educationalist Richard Mulcaster, whose pupils also included such early modern heavyweights as Lancelot Andrews, Edmund Spenser, and Thomas Lodge. As for Kyd's dramatic career in London, Thomas Dekker, in his pamphlet A Knight's Conjuring, linked Industrious Kyd with the actor John Bentley and the poets Thomas Watson and Thomas Akeley, which suggests that Kyd started his playwriting career with the Queen's Men Company, for whom Bentley is known to have acted. In his eulogy on Shakespeare, published in the 1623 First Folio, Ben Jonson placed Sporting Kyd among Shakespeare's peers. Dekker and Jonson's respective epithets, industrious and sporting, suggest that Kyd's canon was much larger than the surviving plays now universally acknowledged as his, and that he may have written comedies while working as a playwright in London.
So you mentioned he was born on Lombard Street, but baptized rather, but where did he live while he was in London? Was he in close physical proximity to the places we have identified with Shakespeare's lodgings?
Unfortunately, Cassidy, I can't give you an exact address, but we know that towards the end of his life, Kyd shared a chamber with fellow dramatist Christopher Marlowe, having likely become acquainted soon after Kyd entered his patron's household, his patron most likely being the Earl of Pembroke or Lord Strange. And it was Kyd's living arrangements with Marlowe in London that would have devastating consequences, of course.
So I know that Marlowe and Kyd were roommates, but were they also in a romantic relationship?
That's difficult to tell. I mean, Kyd's description of Marlowe in the letters to Sir John Puckering would suggest no. Although, as in the case of most early modern playwright biographies, there's little we can be sure about. Kyd writes that my first acquaintance with this Marlowe rose upon his bearing name to serve my lord, although his lordship never knew his service, but in the writing for his players. For never could my lord endure his name or sight when he had heard of his conditions. That I should love or be familiar friend with one so irreligious were very rare. Besides, he was intemperate and of a cruel heart. So although they lodged together, we can't say that they were close friends, let alone lovers. However, their works share a remarkable number of repeated phrases, sometimes almost entire lines, like should come about the person of a king, to give you just one example, Cassidy, suggesting that they had reading knowledge of each other's plays. And although we have no evidence that they ever collaborated, there is plenty of evidence that they influenced each other, let each other read their manuscripts, and so forth. The black comedy we encounter in later Marlowe plays, like The Jew of Malta, seems to be heavily influenced by what Lucas Erne calls Kyd's radical generic experiment in blending comedy and tragedy, something Shakespeare would also do, of course. The most famous example of dark comedy in Kyd's canon would probably be the scene in The Spanish Tragedy, when Pedringano mocks his executioner upon the scaffold, in the mistaken belief that an empty box delivered by a page contains his pardon. Prior to this moment, the page succumbs to curiosity and opens the box, only to discover that Lorenzo, the original Machiavellian villain in Elizabethan drama, has tricked Pedringano. This kind of grisly humor, a man blithely and ignorantly mocking his executioner before being hanged on stage, a moment laced with bitter dramatic irony, would filter into Marlowe and Shakespeare's works. So there's a very close relationship between Marlowe and Kyd's plays, which often causes issues for modern statistical analyses of their stylistic habits. But we can't say that that relationship was romantic. Rather, it might have been more like the relationship between Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher, who, according to biographer John Aubrey, lived together on Bankside near the Playhouse, sharing not only their writing talents, but also a bed, their clothes, and even a lover.
So I've read that he was accused of treason for what one article called subversive political activities. Was Kyd something of a rebel in general?
Again, I think that's very difficult to tell.
But he did get arrested. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Kyd does his best to dissociate himself from accusations of subversion aimed at Marlowe in the letters to Puckering. But if I'm being honest, Cassidy, rebel is a sexier term than most I've heard applied to Kyd's character.
So he was maybe just suffering from the general, I don't know, industry standard or perhaps professional hazard that was being a playwright in Elizabethan England?
Yeah, I think so. As I was saying, in most depictions, he's a rather sober-minded, moralistic figure, and he's diametrically opposed to the swaggering Marlowe, which frankly ignores Johnson's sobriquet sporting and the innovative blend of humour with tragic materials that we find in Kyd's plays. I mean, Kyd's work suggests that he actually had a great sense of humour. So when it comes to reputation, that idle and most false imposition or legacy, I think Kyd has been very unlucky. And on the theme of legacy, let's travel back in time to August 1594. Christopher Marlowe was as dead as a doornail. And his death had been mysterious. Accused of posting bills about London, threatening Protestant refugees, he'd been stabbed in the right eye in a Deptford house by a man known to have been in the employ of the spy master Francis Walsingham, while awaiting a decision on his case by the Privy Council. And Robert Greene was also deceased, having railed against the world of commercial theatre on his deathbed. So when Thomas Kyd died that month, the path was cleared for the young dramatist William Shakespeare, and the ghosts of these dramatic predecessors, each of whom had come to ignominious ends, would haunt Shakespeare throughout his writing career. I mean, much has been written on Shakespeare's relationship with the former playwrights, but to my eyes, modern scholarship has done an injustice when it comes to Kyd's legacy, failing to recognize the extent to which he influenced Shakespeare, and as I would argue, the full extent of his surviving dramatic corpus. And while we're on the theme of a hazardous profession, I think the injustice that Kyd has faced in death echoes the final years of his life. As the authorities suspected Marlowe of writing a heretical poem posted on the walls of a Dutch church, Kyd was arrested and tortured in his absence. And Kyd would die in disgrace despite being an innocent man. And we have to remember that he was released from prison. So if he were a rebel, it seems, sadly, it was a rebel without a patron in his latter days. I don't get the impression he was a subversive character in real life.
So despite being sober-minded, moralistic, and posthumously smeared in reputation, I guess, we do know that in May of 1593, Kyd was arrested along with Marlowe and accused of being in possession of what they called diverse lewd and mutinous libels. Darren, what are libels and what were they supposed to have contained that was so mutinous?
Yeah, exactly. As I just alluded to, Kyd's life and career were essentially ruined by the uproar following the posting on the walls of Austin Friars, the Dutch church in Broad Street, on 5th of May 1593, of a poem calling for the expulsion of foreigners, consisting of 54 lines. And this libel, by which I mean a written defamation, threatened to kill foreigners in your temples praying, and to spill more blood even than the Paris massacre. That invocation of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572 could also be seen as a reference to Marlowe's play, The Massacre at Paris. To top it all off, the poem ends with a declaration of authorship per Tamburlaine. So the links with Marlowe are frankly inescapable, and the authorities would have immediately suspected him. Although my colleague Matthew Dimmock has ascribed the authorship of this libel to the notoriously xenophobic novelist and ballad writer Thomas Maloney. So Kyd was swept up in these proceedings when Marlowe's chambers, which were Kyd's chambers too, of course, were searched. And during this search of the dramatist's chambers, another document was discovered, which was described by Kyd as fragments of a disputation, and was, according to a note outside of the document, vile heretical conceits denying the deity of Jesus Christ, our Saviour. This meant that Kyd was now answerable to the charge of atheism, a very serious charge indeed, more or less equivalent to treason. Kyd wrote to Sir John Pickering, who was Keeper of the Great Seal of England and head of the Privy Council at the time, that the fragments of a disputation had been affirmed by Marlowe to be his and shuffled with some of mine, unknown to me, by some occasion of our writing in one chamber 2 years since. And just to add to the tragedy, Cassidy, the fragments of a disputation found in Kyd's possession, which he had claimed belonged to Marlowe, were later revealed to be what has been described as an innocuous tract from 1549 by John Proctor.
So it wasn't even something that he should have been arrested for in the first place.
Apparently not. I haven't been able to read this tract myself, so I haven't been able to offer my sort of censorious opinion, but no,
well,
apparently.
It sounds so much like he was targeted, like he's being, someone just didn't like him and was trying to sort of pin things on him that he may not have deserved. But as you mentioned, he was eventually released from prison, and I find that really surprising. Was this letter that he wrote to Pickering sort of his saving grace here? Why did he not get executed?
Yeah, potentially, Cassidy. I think in reality, most people in Kyd's position would have done anything and everything they could do to save their own skins. And we have to remember that Marlowe was dead. So Kyd was informing on someone deceased, potentially, as you suggest, to save himself from execution. And a lot of scholars and novelists actually have characterized Kyd as cowardly, but maybe he was just being pragmatic. This is a man who had undergone pains and undeserved tortures, possibly in Bridewell, a man facing disgrace and facing poverty. And some of the accusations Kyd made against Marlowe were supported by contemporary accounts. Kyd indicates that his patron would have had a low opinion of Marlowe's character. And Richard Baines accused Marlowe of being an atheist who famously loved tobacco and boys. We should, however, note in the case of Baines that this Elizabethan double agent and informer seems to really relish blackening Marlowe's name. So, a lot of writers have discovered there's plenty of scope for conspiracy theories here. It's really fascinating insight into, the remarkable lives of these playwrights.
So he turns in Marlowe thinking that, you can't insult your friends if they're dead and not there to protest. So he turns him in and gets released. But what happens to him after he goes back into society? Does he return to life as normal?
Well, so after Kyd was released, possibly suffering from the pangs of torture in the aftermath of imprisonment, he's desperately seeking patronage, and he's hoping to evade poverty. And the last we hear from Kyd is the publication of Cornelia, early in 1594. And in the dedication to the Countess of Sussex, he alludes to the bitter times and privy broken passions he had endured. And in that same dedication is the promise of another tragedy called Portia as his next summer's better travel, which never appeared. Kyd died later that year at the age of 35, and we can't be sure of the cause of death. And he was buried on the 15th of August in St. Mary Cold Church in London, which was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666, meaning that his grave is lost to posterity. Some scholars have suggested that Kyd's interpolation in his translation of Garnier's closet drama Cornelia is biographical. And I think whether we agree that Kyd is speaking from personal experience in the following speech or not, I reckon we can all agree that it's hauntingly beautiful poetry. The cheerful cock, the sad night's comforter, waiting upon the rising of the sun, doth sing to see how Cynthia shrinks her horn, while Clete takes her progress to the east, where, ringing wet with drops of silver dew, her wonted tears of love she doth renew. The wandering swallow with her broken song, the country wench unto her work awakes, while Cytherea, sighing, walks to seek her murdered love transformed into a rose, whom though she see, to crop she kindly fears, but kissing sighs, and dews him with her tears. Sweet tears of love, remembrances to time past with me, that am to tears converted, whose mournful passions dull the morning's joys, whose sweeter sleeps are turned to fearful dreams, and whose first fortunes, filled with all distress, afford no hope of future happiness. So that last line really stands out, I think, where Kyd was creatively and potentially personally at that stage of his life. It's also possible, by the way, that Kyd was collaborating with Shakespeare at around the same time he wrote Cornelia. And if it's okay with you, I'll speak more about that anon.
Well, I think that was one of my other questions. Was Edward III is a play that often comes up is being attributed to both Kyd and Shakespeare, and still other scholars saying it was a co-authored piece written by both of them at the same time. Do we know if Kyd wrote Edward III, or what other plays can be attributed to him?
Yeah, you've worked me out straight away, Cassidy. That is the play I was going to talk about, and I think the internal evidence strongly suggests that Shakespeare co-authored Edward III with Kyd, with Shakespeare responsible for scenes involving the Countess of Salisbury and a later scene in which Prince Edward is taunted by French heralds, and Kyd the remainder. Some scholars argue that Shakespeare revised this play, but the evidence suggests to me an orthodox collaboration, by which I mean these dramatists sat down together and plotted the play and then worked on their divisions of labor more or less concurrently. I've got a book in progress with the working title of Shakespeare's Tutor, The Influence of Thomas Kyd. And by tutor, I don't mean the kind of relationship Lucentio has with Bianca in The Taming of the Shrew, or Marlowe's proposed relationship with Arabella Stuart. The title is inspired by Ben Jonson, who distinguished different authorial collaborators: coadjutor, novice, journeyman, or tutor. Now, as my colleague Stanley Wells puts it in his book Shakespeare and Co., a coadjutor would be an equal collaborator, a novice a kind of apprentice, a journeyman a hack, brought in perhaps to supply a comic subplot, and a tutor a master craftsman guiding a novice. Now, in the case of Edward III, probably written around 1593, according to the world's leading scholar on chronology, Martin Wiggins, Kyd would have been the more experienced dramatist, the master craftsman. And throughout his career, Shakespeare would continue to engage with and learn from Kyd through processes of revision, adaptation, and collaboration. We may therefore regard Kyd as an even more important dramatic predecessor than has hitherto been acknowledged. We may regard him as a tutor to Shakespeare. Now, Kyd is traditionally accepted as the author of 3 surviving plays: The Spanish Tragedy, Solomon and Perseida, which is a tragedy of love, in which the heroine of the play exacts revenge for the execution of her lover by tricking the Turkish emperor into kissing her poisoned lips, and Cornelia. And I'm associate editor for a forthcoming edition of the works of Thomas Kyd, the first since 1901, headed by general editor Brian Vickers, and to be published by Boydell and Brewer. And we're arguing for a larger and more varied canon of works on the basis of rigorous qualitative and quantitative analysis of Kyd's distinct style and overall dramaturgy. So we assign the true chronicle history of King Lear, a hilarious version of the Lear story, which, like all of Shakespeare's sources, concludes happily with Lear restored to his throne. Arden of Faversham, a domestic tragedy detailing the grisly murder of Thomas Arden by a couple of bumbling assassins, his wife and her lover, and a comedy called Fair Em, the Miller's Daughter of Manchester, to Kyd as sole author, and Edward III as a co-authored play, which has been edited by a previous guest of yours, I believe, Cassidy, the late, great Shakespeare scholar, David Bevington. He edits another play in that edition, actually, the play known as Henry VI Part 1 in Shakespeare's first folio. And we're arguing that that play was originally written by Kyd and Thomas Nash for the Lord Stranger's Men. The plays known as Henry VI Part 2 and Henry VI Part 3 in the first folio were most likely written by Shakespeare for Pembroke's Men in 1591, and they were originally separated from the seminal play of Henry VI, and they don't advertise themselves as sequels to that play. Rather, Henry VI Part 1, known originally simply as Harry VI, seems to have been an effort by a rival playing company in 1592 to capitalize on the success of Shakespeare's earlier chronicle history efforts. It seems Shakespeare was commissioned by the Chamberlain's Men, founded in summer 1594, to adapt the original Harry VI text in order to turn the Henry VI plays, previously unconnected, into a 3-part serial, with Henry VI Part 1 as a rather narratologically awkward prequel, the early modern equivalent in terms of continuity issues of The Phantom Menace. In the narrative of Kyd's dramatic career that I'm presenting, Shakespeare used 2 of Kyd's plays as direct sources for his greatest tragedies, Hamlet and King Lear. He revised 2 of Kyd's plays, The Spanish Tragedy, which I'll speak about a bit more shortly, and Harry VI, and he collaborated directly with Kyd on Edward III. So I think an acknowledgement of Kyd's restored canon could help us further understand the development of Shakespeare's dramaturgy. I think Kyd's influence on early Shakespeare was almost or just as profound as Marlowe's, and it's not surprising that in the case of plays like the domestic tragedy Arden of Faversham, which has been attributed to Kyd for centuries, scholars are struggling to distinguish Kyd and early Shakespeare styles. I mean, after all, Kyd was a real innovator. He experimented with his blank verse, introducing feminine endings, a rather sexist term, meaning unstressed 11 syllables concluding verse lines. The most famous example in the early modern canon, of course, being Hamlet's "to be or not to be, that is the question," with a frequency surpassing any pre-Shakespearean dramatists, and compounding adjectives like flaxen-haired, hollow-eyed, and here's a real corker for you, Cassidy, pinky-eyed with inventiveness, whereas most Elizabethan writers eschewed such forms in their plays. So in some respects, Shakespeare's early style is closer to Kyd's than it is to Marlowe's. Although earlier scholars recognise that Kyd exerted a considerable influence on Shakespeare's career, a few modern scholars have given him the credit he deserves, and I and my co-editor, we're hoping to change that.
I'm looking forward to seeing that come together and really sort of give credit to Kyd for that influence. I think one of the most profound influences that I guess is really contested at this point among scholars. So I'm going to ask you what you think about it, and that is the influence of Hamlet on Shakespeare's Hamlet. Now, for those of us for whom Kyd's work, and especially the idea of Hamlet, it might be a new discovery or idea, please explain, Darren, first what Hamlet means, and then did Shakespeare use Kyd's work as an inspiration for his Hamlet? You talked about the to be or not to be speech, but what evidence is there that Kyd is behind the Hamlet?
Well, means primitive or original, of course. And in my view, there are strong indications that Kyd wrote a Hamlet play in the late 1580s, which is now unfortunately lost. And I would do anything to get my hands on that original Hamlet play. So if your listeners can check their attics, check their basements, and get back to
the floorboards, yes,
indeed. Kyd, like Shakespeare, didn't have a university education, so he was also open to criticism from what George Saintsbury called the university wits. And Thomas Nash seems to have attacked Kyd in his preface to Green's Menaphon, which has helped scholars to identify Kyd as the author of the so-called Hamlet. And Nash alludes to the kid in Aesop, which strikes me as an obvious pun on Kyd's name, who has left the trade of being a professional scribe and now meddles with Italian translations, as Kyd had done with his translation, The Householder's Philosophy. And Nash claims that Kyd believes the Roman dramatist Seneca line by line in order to afford you whole Hamlets. And Nash derives the opening of Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy in particular, for Kyd thrusts Elysium into hell during Andrea's account of his descent into the lower world. And Nash also claims that Kyd is prone to bodge up a blank verse with ifs and ands, which parodies a line from the Spanish Tragedy. What villain ifs and ands offer to kill him? Now, a lot has been written on Nash's attack, and I think it does point very strongly towards Kyd as the author of the Hamlet. But I've tried to take that scholarly narrative a little bit further. So I've suggested elsewhere that our understanding of Thomas Nash's famous diatribe against Kyd can be informed by a reading of Robert Greene's attack against the anonymous author of the comedy I mentioned earlier, Fair M, the Miller's Daughter of Manchester, which is in part about William the Conqueror falling in love with a picture on a shield, and in part about the daughter of a miller pretending to be deaf and blind to avoid numerous suitors. Greene ridiculed the author of Fair M in a work called Farewell to Folly. And the editor and scholar Thomas H. Dickinson noted that there are indications that Greene would have been quite willing to ridicule Kyd. And in fact, the opening of Greene's attack, Others Will Flout, resembles Kyd's hint at the existence of hostile critics in his dedication to Thomas Reid in The Householder's Philosophy, Let Others Carp. Now, in Farewell to Folly, Greene criticizes the author of Fair M's borrowings from theological poets. In his letter to Sir John Pickering, Kyd projected a poem on the conversion of St. Paul. So Kyd fits Greene's profile of a poet who writes works of theological cast. And Green's image of a man who hath a familiar style and can indite a whole year and never be beholding to art recalls Nash's attack against the author of the Hamlet, that run through every art and thrive by none, to leave the trade of noverint whereto they were born, and busy themselves with the endeavours of art. And by noverint, Nash is referring to the trade of scriveners or clerks. Green's line, he that cannot write true English without the help of clerks of parish churches will needs make himself the father of interludes, it suggests to me that the author of Fair M was a professional copyist but had turned to playwriting. And furthermore, as the scholar Eric Sams pointed out, there's no direct evidence that Kyd was ever a churchman of any persuasion, but his scrivener father Francis had been a churchwarden at St. Mary Woolnoth's in Lombard Street, not far from Cripplegate. And it's possible that in his allusion to St. Giles without Cripplegates, in the line, I am persuaded the sexton of St. Giles would have been ashamed of such blasphemous rhetoric, Green was following Nash in evoking Kyd's name. So St. Giles, the protector of rams and deer, was a Christian hermit from Athens who was crippled when a hunter's arrow, intended for his companion, a young deer, wounded him. And more significant, perhaps, is the fact that the vicar of St. Giles Church at the time, between 1588 and 1605, was the bishop and scholar Lancelot Andrews, Kyd's schoolfellow. So both Nash and Green label the subject of their respective attacks as a plagiarist and dunce, or as the scholar T.W. Baldwin put it, a degreeless person who produces plays that are compared favorably with the work of better educated dramatists. And Baldwin argued that Nash and Green were both attacking the same author. So whoever wrote the Hamlet also wrote Fair M. In my view, Green's attack is practically identical to Nash's invective against Kyd and his education at Merchant Taylor's, as well as his background as a scribe. And it's notable that Fair M has been attributed to Kyd on entirely different evidentiary grounds, like its use of the same source material Kyd used in his tragedies, The Spanish Tragedy and Solomon and Persuader, Henry Wotton's A Courtly Controversy of Cupid's Courtels, which was printed by Kyd's father's acquaintance, Francis Caldock, as well as striking similarities in language and verse style. And as for the Hamlet, according to Henslow's diary, the play was performed at Newington Butts on the 9th of June, 1594. And 2 years after the record of this performance, Thomas Lodge alluded to the old play in his Wit's Misery, looks as pale as the visit of the ghost which cried so miserably at the theatre, like an oyster wife, Hamlet, revenge. So we know the Hamlet introduced a ghost to the story, which isn't found in any other sources, a ghost that interacts with a living human, no less, just as the ghost of Pompeii interacts with the eponymous character Cornelia in Kyd's translation of Robert Garnier's French drama. Now, Senecan ghosts don't tend to interact with living people. So Kyd, despite Nash's criticisms, appears to be innovating here rather than bleeding Roman tragedies line by line. I think it's fair to say, actually, that Kyd refined Seneca for the English stage. So although the evidence isn't clear-cut, the fact that the play to which the arguably most famous piece of English literature is heavily indebted was likely written by Kyd says much for his influence on Shakespeare's drama. And another striking fact is that all major authorship attribution scholars now agree that Shakespeare contributed to the editions found in the 1602 edition of Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy. And these editions, on the basis of contemporary allusions, must have been written by the late 1590s. For instance, John Marston satirized the so-called painter scene in his two Antonio plays, which are generally dated 1599 and 1600. A lot of scholars point out that Shakespeare had the Spanish tragedy in mind while writing Hamlet. The play within a play device as a means of exacting revenge is a really obvious borrowing, for instance. And it may well also be that Shakespeare's memory of the Spanish tragedy was refreshed as a result of his revisions to the play, and that one of the reasons why Hamlet echoes the Spanish tragedy so closely is because Shakespeare was deeply familiar with kids' drama, including the old Hamlet.
That certainly makes sense. And I think it's fascinating, all these different pieces that we can take and pull together and sort of build a picture of Thomas Kyd and who he was from all of these different references. But I'm surprised, I think, at the fact that the letter that Kyd wrote after being imprisoned and presumably under duress functions as our primary source of an entire life for this guy. And I study Shakespeare, so I'm used to there not being much information. But I think even for Shakespeare, we have more than a single letter to attribute to him. And I think it's striking that there's not more to go on for Thomas Kyd. What happened to the records for his life?
Well, in some respects, we actually have surviving records for Kyd that we don't have for Shakespeare. So unlike Kyd, we don't have a surviving letter written by Shakespeare. We have a surviving letter that was to be delivered to him. There's no indication that he ever received it. And we don't have a record of Shakespeare's enrolling at school. We also know from the Archdeaconry of London Probate and Administration Act book, as a real mouthful, that Anna Kyd, the dramatist's mother, had, in the name of her deceased husband, legally dissociated herself from any liability for her son's goods, rights, and credits upon his death, which indicates that she was absolving herself of responsibility for his debt. So this information tells us something about Kyd's financial situation in his later years. But in other respects, as you rightly point out, Cassidy, we have less surviving documents for Kyd than we do Shakespeare. We don't have a surviving likeness of Kyd, so we don't know what he looked like, for example. I'm hoping that renewed interest in Kyd will lead to searches for more documentation, and maybe we'll unearth more information.
Again, pull up your floorboard, search your attics.
Yeah.
It's got to be somewhere.
Go for it, and personally email me. I don't think Kyd or Shakespeare are that unusual in the context of extant documents from the early modern period, especially the Elizabethan period. And of course, the biographical implications are similar for much later professional dramatists like Aphra Behn, for whom we have snippets of a fascinating life. I guess many grains get lost in the great tide of history. And I'm reminded of a passage from Tom Stoppard's play Arcadia: "We shed as we pick up, like travelers who must carry everything in their arms. And what we let fall will be picked up by those behind."
Well, I know you've sold us on the life of Thomas Kyd, and we definitely want to learn more about him and explore what there is to know about his life and the plays that he wrote. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
Well, anyone interested in Thomas Kyd's biography should read the following two books. So Arthur Freeman's Thomas Kyd, A Study of Facts and Problems, which was published in 1967, and Lucas Ernst's Beyond the Spanish Tragedy, A Study of the Works of Thomas Kyd, which was published in 2001. A Kyd specialist recently told me that I've written more peer-reviewed articles on Kyd than any other scholar in history. I'm not sure if that's true, but listeners interested in my work can find links to articles on Kyd as well as Shakespeare and many other dramatists by going to darrenfj.wordpress.com. And no scholar has done more to revive Kyd's reputation than Brian Vickers. So it's really worth reading his published and forthcoming work. And a scholar named Rebecca Owens, who is also on the editorial board for the New Kyd edition, has some remarkable forthcoming work showing the deleterious effect that Frederick S. Bowes' edition of Kyd's works has had on the dramatist's reputation.
We will link to these resources and more all in the show notes for today's episode, so make sure you check there to find those. Now, Darren, as you know, having been a repeat guest here for us on That Shakespeare Life, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and you will have the option to select a new desert island book, should you wish. But the question is, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
This is always the toughest question on your podcast, Cassidy. When I was in college at the age of 16 to 17, two works I studied really captured my imagination, and they've stayed with me. They were Shakespeare's King Lear and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Some of the language in Bronte's novel is so beautiful. Alongside many Shakespeare speeches, I still have Heathcliff's words in my head. I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. I know that ghosts have wandered the earth. Be with me always. And that speech is always done in the voice of Timothy Dalton in my head.
Of course. There's no other way.
I'd love to read that book again. It's been years since I've read it. I think I'd finally have the time while on a deserted island
to give it the focus it needs, for sure. Well, okay. Yeah. So you've alluded to some of the things that you're working on, but tell us what's next for you. What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust are doing some incredibly exciting work in terms of expanding their digital and outreach offering. And I'm very much looking forward to getting back to lecturing. Research-wise, I've got an article forthcoming in Early Modern Literary Studies concerning recent claims that the poet Thomas Watson, who was a close acquaintance of Kyd, had a hand in Ardna Faversham. I show that none of the evidence that has been provided, such as literary influences, knowledge of London locations, and the intermingling of comic and tragic elements, renders Watson a more likely candidate than Kyd. And the article concludes that the claims for Watson's involvement actually strengthen the case for Kyd's sole authorship of Ardna Faversham. I've recently been working on Robert Greene's canon, because there's not that many doing that. So I think I provide some useful evidence in favor of expanding his dramatic corpus from 5 plays to 7. And of course, Greene, very famous as a prolific pamphleteer, but he was also an important dramatist. So I think it's important to try and determine what the scope of his dramatic canon was. I'm also working on identifying the author of a rediscovered restoration play with my dear friend, the American scholar Joseph Stevenson. Have you had him on your show yet?
Not yet. I have not had that pleasure.
I hope he's forthcoming. He's great. And I'm collaborating with my wonderful colleague at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, Nick Walton, on a book chapter concerning Shakespeare heritage tourism in Stratford-upon-Avon. Of course, I'm also working on the New Kyd edition, which we hope will be published by Boydell and Brewer in the next few years. And I've got a full draft of my monograph, Shakespeare's Tutor, The Influence of Thomas Kyd, just waiting, at the time of speaking, for a publisher. So if any of your listeners are interested about that, I'd love to hear from them.
Absolutely.
So lots going on, Cassie. Lots going on.
Just a little bit to keep you busy there. Yeah, for sure. But it's all exciting stuff. I can't wait to read your monograph, as well as see all of these compilations of canons for Robert Greene and Thomas Kyd come to fruition. As always, Darren Freebury Jones, thank you so much for being here and joining us on the show. This has been delightful.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed myself, and I hope your listeners enjoyed this episode.
find links to more information on Thomas Kyd, the Spanish tragedy, and Hamlet, as well as to Darren's blog, where you can explore his research into the life of this innovative playwright. It's all packed into the show notes for today's episode. You can find this at CassidyCash.com/episode 134. That's CassidyCash.com/EP134. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right, That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available, and not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.